A U.S. Senator, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, well before he became president, wrote a book. And the title of this book was Profiles in Courage. But we should ask, when a politician talks about political courage, what does political courage mean to the politician? Well, very often, to JFK, political courage meant doing what voters did not want. Political courage meant violating the great dream of democracy, which is that the citizens should be telling the government what to do. To John F. Kennedy and to many politicians, to many political theorists throughout the centuries, being a good, successful political leader sometimes meant doing what the voters didn't want. So that meant that 100% pure democracy was not the path to the best possible form of governance. So, a long time ago, I worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked there a couple of times in the United States Senate. So I worked first as an intern, and then later as a staffer to two different United States senators. And I worked on economic policy, on tax policy, to some extent on labor market regulation. And in the United States Congress, there are two houses. It's a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives, every single member of the House of Representatives has a 2-year term. Every single member of the House of Representatives has to go back to the voters for approval every 2 years. In the United States Senate, by contrast, and this picture looks directly at the Senate, which is on the north side of the building. In the United States Senate, senators have 6-year terms. The founding fathers of the United States thought that 6 years was enough time to give politicians a little distance from the voters, a little distance from the people who put them in office. And this is just a theory, right? Politicians, people who create governments, political philosophers, people who think about government just informally have a lot of theories. But what do these kinds of differences mean in practice? When some politicians have to go back to the voters every 2 years, do they actually behave differently than politicians who have to go back to the voters every 6 years? Well, I can tell you that having been a Senate staffer for a little while, I saw what everyone around me saw, which is that senators start behaving totally differently when they're 2 years away from re-election. You might informally say that for the first 4 years, they're trying to act like grand statesmen, trying to act like people who are changing the nature of the world and changing the nature of America and shaping ideas. The last 2 years, they're going home to their voters, they're shaking hands, they're kissing babies. So we all knew this in terms of scheduling. When you're scheduling your senator, if your senator is in the first 4 years of the term, the senator's going to be around in D.C. a lot. Of course, he'll go home a lot, but he's got a lot of time to actually work and think about policy and work on legislation. The last 2 years, lots of visits home, lots of flights back to the home district. Now, of course, that's just something we saw. But you'd want to ask, does this matter for policy? Do politicians actually vote differently? Do they push for different kinds of legislation when elections are looming? And is that legislation better or is it worse? Well, one thing that we learned, that I learned from watching things and that academic researchers have learned through statistical research, is that politicians think that we voters, we citizens, are a lot like the character Dory in the movie Finding Nemo. As you may remember, Dory in Finding Nemo, she just couldn't remember anything, like anything that happened more than 30 or 45 seconds ago. It's as if it didn't happen at all. And that's what politicians think of us. What you should ask yourself is, are the politicians right? Now, I tend to think politicians are actually experts in paying attention to voters. So if they have a model of voters, you should probably put a lot of weight on their model of voters, right? You can pay attention to scientific studies, you can pay attention to punditry, but these folks are experts on voters. They got us to elect them. So how do they behave differently? Well, I'm starting with a craven example here, a very sort of crude example in a way. United States senators, when they have this 6-year term, they make sure that when they're pushing for funding for bridges or hospitals or faster internet connections back in their home state, they make sure to push for that funding in the last 2 years of their terms, right before they're going to show up for the voters, right? So politicians, as they say, backload the pork. So pork is spending that's targeted at your district, targeted at your state. So politicians make a strong effort to backload the pork to right before an election. So politicians think that we won't remember something that was done 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. And they're probably right. Another piece of evidence that we voters have short-term memories, and that we're not that good at keeping track of what our government does, comes from political campaigns. If you're in the United States, at least, which is heavily studied, in the United States, it turns out that one of the best ways to predict how a president is going to do in an election campaign is how the economy was doing about 9 months before the election. So from the point of view of citizens choosing the leader of one of the largest, richest countries in the world, the people who show up to these elections can barely remember anything that happened more than 9 months before the election. So this is a reminder, the mental limitations, the cognitive limitations of we voters seem to be strong. And senators build their policies around that. And presidents have to remember, I better have a really good economy in my election year. Because if it was good 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that's like saying it happened in the Middle Ages. That's like saying it happened on an episode of Game of Thrones. So, another issue, but these are sort of like crass issues, right? Like running for office or bringing home the bacon, bringing home pork right before a re-election campaign. What I started thinking about, I don't know, actually in about 2009, was, do politicians actually vote differently on the legislation that's in front of them right before an election? And as I was wondering about it, it turned out that some very good economists had actually been doing research on this very topic. So if there's one area where economists tend to agree with each other, almost the vast majority of economists, regardless of their partisan political affiliation, economists both in the US and in Europe, where there have been a lot of surveys made, one area is free trade. Economists tend to believe that tariffs, trade barriers, make people poor overall, and that even lower income workers tend to benefit from freer trade agreements. So it's not exactly a rising tide that lifts all boats, but it's a rising tide that lifts the vast majority of boats if we can remove trade barriers and let countries trade freely and peacefully. So this is something where the experts in the field think one thing, and when you ask voters what they think of trade deals, they're very skeptical. They're very worried that they're going to lose a lot of jobs at home and that the costs will outweigh the benefits. So voters on one side, experts on the other. How do the senators decide between the two? Well, it turns out that in the first 4 years of a senator's term, the senator is pretty likely to support free trade agreements. But in the last 2 years, right before re-election time, the senator is 10 percentage points less likely to support this very same kind of deal. To pick an extreme example of this, the authors point this out in their paper. They point out that Senator Hillary Clinton, who was a senator from New York before she ran for president, Senator Hillary Clinton, when she was elected senator, she voted for every single free trade deal that came before her in her first 4 years as a senator. And in her last 2 years as a senator, when she's getting ready for re-election, she voted against every single free trade deal. So she was an extreme version of this case, which is, I don't know exactly what was going on in her mind. It's hard to know what's going on in the mind of any particular politician, but I can watch their behavior and form a model. And the model that one can form of a senator is, yeah, I know these trade deals are actually good for people and they help people overall in the long run as a general rule, but I don't know, these voters just really don't like it. So I can't give the voter the medicine that would be good for the voter. So these folks tested this a lot of different ways. It was really hard to beat up the result. Senators they vote differently in an election year. They're not just going home to shake hands with voters and kiss babies. They're actually pushing for different policies when they have to be, the closer they get to the voters. So, but this is just all stuff about America. It'd be good to have some evidence from other countries. Turns out, as you know, of course, the International Monetary Fund is in the business of making big loan packages to countries that get into financial crises. And often, generally, the IMF, before it gives a country a big loan package, it says, well, if we're going to give you this package, we want you to enact some reforms that are going to make your country richer and help you pay the bills, help you pay back the loans that we gave you. And the IMF is widely considered to be extremely powerful. It strikes terror into the hearts of governments and voters around the world. But the IMF is afraid of one thing more than people are afraid of the IMF. The IMF is afraid of voters. In this study that I cite here, the researchers found that when an economic crisis happens in a country that's just less than 6 months away from an election, the IMF attaches fewer strings. It requires less economic reform in the package. And these are reforms that actually are likely to make the country richer. So, and when an election is more than 6 months away and the financial crisis happens, the IMF, basically lays out a long list of requirements. So the further a country is away from an election when the crisis happens, the longer the list of reforms the IMF imposes. The closer to an election, the shorter the list of reforms the IMF will propose. So the IMF is afraid of voters. And these are reforms that these authors particularly looked at labor market liberalization because it's a little easier to measure, because there's very broad-based consensus on this. When looking at this area to see what economists thought of this, I only looked at Europeans, because I know European economists are more skeptical than American economists of labor market liberalization. It turns out even European economists are quite supportive of labor market liberalization. Things like reducing minimum wages, reducing the fees you have to pay to fire a worker, the amount of employment protection that a worker has. These kinds of conditions tend to lower unemployment rates, tend to increase employment in the formal sector of the economy, and tend to make the economy richer overall, tend to make the typical person richer. So these kind of reforms, experts are on one side, thinking these kind of reforms in general, at least to a moderate degree, are pretty good. Voters themselves seem to be against it, so against it that the IMF does not prescribe. So think of this as a doctor who says, boy, there's this medicine that'd be really great for the patient. It tastes bad, and you might have some side effects for a week or two, but I really can't give this medicine to the patient. Maybe I'll just give a half dose and hope that it works out okay. This is what the IMF is in the position of doing when elections loom and an economic crisis happens. The IMF, afraid to give good economic advice, good economic required policy advice to voters. So overall, the message here is that politicians are reluctant to give citizens policy reforms that are actually seem to be good for the citizens themselves. And that's especially so when an election is close at hand, closer to the voters, further from economic wisdom. So there's another area where there's a big distance kept between voters and policy. And this is one that folks here in Ecuador, of course, have an enormous amount of experience with. And this is with central banking and monetary policy. So here's the US Federal Reserve, a place that's been since about a century kept quite independent from the voters. But here's a famous study here's a little scatter plot from a study that economists love to include in our freshman textbooks and to illustrate why the world seems to be better off when you put monetary policy into the hands of my team. Of course, everyone's happy to say, like, you should give my team power, right? Everyone thinks they should be the powerful ones. I think I should be powerful. You think you should be powerful. But what we should really do is do what they do in sports. We should roll the tape. We should have a replay. We should see what the data say about these claims. So, around the world, some central banks, these are the agencies that are in charge of monetary policy, some central banks are very closely connected to the elected government. They can be fired by the prime minister at any time, for instance. Other central banks, the people who work for the central banks, are kept very far from the government. The United States is one example. The people who run the United States Federal Reserve have 14-year terms. The former president, Donald Trump, talked for quite a long time on Twitter about how he wanted to fire some of these folks because he didn't like the decisions they were making. But he couldn't because Congress made that impossible. So the president of the United States, weaker than the head of the Federal Reserve Board, unable to fire the head of the Federal Reserve. These long terms create independence. A lot like judges. In many countries, judges can't be fired by the government, right? This gives independence. And what do we mean by independence? Often, we mean independence from the voters. We mean there's some parts of governance where we want a little bit less democracy. Central banking seems to be one of those. Now, you might think this is all just serving the interests of insiders and elites, and economists want central banks to be independent so that economists can have fun jobs, and so then we can please our Wall Street masters, something like that. But again, you can roll the tape on this. This is one early paper, one early contribution to a much longer literature. Two Harvard professors, Alberta Alesina, recently passed away, Larry Summers, who worked for Bill Clinton and later worked for Barack Obama. And what they did is they just collected data. They checked, let's see how independent are central banks in different countries from the government. And then let's look and see what the average inflation rate was in these different countries. And as you can see this scatter plot over this time period, this was a period of about the 70s and 80s. As you can see here, Switzerland, Germany, and the USA had the most, they had central banks that were quite independent. They were quite undemocratic. And they had low inflation rates. And in this time period, New Zealand, Spain, and Italy had very democratic central banks, very close to the voters. And as you can see, they had higher inflation rates. So there's a pretty clear trade-off there, right? More independence, lower inflation. Less independence, more democratic, higher inflation. They might think, well, why do I care about inflation? What I really care about is wages. What I really care about is the unemployment rate. Well, if you look at that, if I didn't bring that graph, but that graph just looks like a cloud. It turns out there's no relationship at all between central bank independence and what your country's average unemployment rate is, how fast incomes are growing, how stable your economy is. It's a free lunch. Economists have this saying that there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, something we borrowed from a science fiction novel, which in turn came from someplace much earlier. But you know what? Central banking looks like a free lunch. You get lower average inflation, you get the same level of economic growth, the same unemployment rate. All you have to give up is just a little bit of democracy. Just a little bit. Anyway, so getting money out of the hands of the politicians seems to be a free lunch. It's bad news for the politicians. It's also bad news for the voters because it means reminding people that we're not the best decision makers. We're sometimes very short-sighted. These folks with 14-year terms, they can be pretty far-sighted in ways that a lot of us can't be. Now, of course, a lot of this, the benefits of having an independent monetary policy are well known here in Ecuador. One of the things that I did yesterday is I visited the central bank, and I actually picked up a copy of a collection of sucre. They're right here. I have them right here. They're great. They're beautiful, gorgeous, from the last issue in 1999. And but of course, Ecuador did something that quite a few countries have done over the last few decades, and other countries have done over the centuries. They decided to just say, we're not going to have our democracy run monetary policy at all. We're not even going to have one of our government agencies run it. We're just going to let foreigners run it. And often that works out pretty well. I can't say it's a totally free lunch. There are obviously some trade-offs. But this is an example that has worked well. Now, this idea of having foreigners run a lot of your government is something that I'm a big fan of. And one example of that is this building itself. The United States Federal Reserve, unlike many U.S. government agencies, is allowed to hire foreigners for almost any position. You don't have to be an American citizen. In America, we don't have to hire the smartest economists in the United States. In the United States, we can hire the smartest economists in the world. Like, a lot of countries just take it for granted that your government bureaucracy has to be filled with people from your country. But why just hire in your country? Why not find the best people anywhere? So there are quite a few countries that do this with their judiciary, that have foreign judges sitting on their judiciary to give them true independence. Independence from their government's bureaucracy, independence from their government's norms, independence from their country's voters. So judiciaries do this. The United States Federal Reserve does this. If you look around, you'll notice that quite a few countries around the world allow foreigners to work in high-level government positions. This idea that patriotism is an absolutely indispensable ingredient for good government policy is just a fairy tale. Whenever we've tested it, it looks like there are many exceptions to this rule, and there are good reasons to try to find the best people in the world in your government, just like you'd want the best people in the world working in your hospitals or in your schools. So this takes me to a great question of really a question of political philosophy, which is who should govern, right? Of course, it's been a philosophical debate that's formally gone on since ancient Athens, well over 2,000 years ago. The debate between whether having the demos, the masses running the government, or whether one should have a few elites, an oligarchy running the government, or whether one should just have one person running things, a monarch. But in the last few decades, another intellectual movement has sprung forth that's portions of it were always in our intellectual atmosphere, but they'd never really coalesced, to my knowledge. Rather than saying we should just have the few rich people in our town run things, or have everybody in town run things, or have one person whose grandfather's grandfather once got a sword from an angel run things, well, why not just try to have rule by the informed? This is an extreme position, but it's known as epistocracy. Episto meaning knowing, and krasi meaning ruling. Rule by the informed. So, of course, as with any governance proposal, you shouldn't think of this as either or, 100% or 0%. You know that you don't live in a pure democracy. You know that you don't vote for each government position on your smartphone every day. Totally electronically feasible now, but we don't do that, and there's very little pressure for it. So we allow some insiders, some elites, to have some influence over government. We have a bit of oligarchy blended with our democracy. Maybe it's worth thinking how much epistocracy we want it blended with our democracy as well. Philosopher Jason Brennan, who's at Georgetown University, smart guy, he summed it up this way. He makes a human rights claim to epistocracy. He says, people have a right to good governance. People have a right to a good government. They don't just have right to government. They have right to good, high-quality government. And he says, in a democracy, we know that some of the people who are participating in government are not qualified. They're very poorly informed. Some of them have very bad values by almost any of our measures, too. We're letting some people with very bad values and very low levels of information, and very inaccurate information, participate in this process. They're probably not a majority, but do they have a right to participate in this system? Well, if you want to argue that democracy, mass participation of everyone, is the most important, sacred, and violable right, well, there's nothing we can argue about. What Brennan points out is that there's a tension between the universal right to participate in government and the right to competent government. There's a tension. And usually, in economics, when I see a tension between two things, I figure the right answer is probably going to wind up somewhere in the middle. There's going to be some kind of Goldilocks point where things are neither too hot nor too cold, where we have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they go together to make a good recipe. So Brennan points out this paradox that universal democracy violates the right to competent government, and he's pushed for some reforms in the way a philosopher would, some very technical, abstract ideas. I want to actually push in a different direction, and first start off with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. This quote, I saw it for the first time on the walls of the Library of Congress, which is in a building right next to the Capitol. Our liberty can never be safe but in the hands of the people themselves. That means he loves democracy, which he did. And then look at the second half of the sentence. And that, too, of the people with a certain degree of instruction. People who know something. People who are educated. So the first half, democracy. The second half, epistocracy. Clearly, Jefferson sees the need for some kind of balance between these two for the optimal level of governance. And we should be thinking through whether we have the right balance of that in our countries in a way that accords with our views of human rights and human dignity. Now, there are a lot of ways that different countries around the world have thought about this. There's a very crude correlation that most people know of, which is that in most countries, people who are more educated are just more likely to vote. So there's this sort of natural kind of epistocracy that just happens a little bit by the fact that more educated people are more likely to show up on voting day. But Ireland's Senate is an example of this, of a mild form of epistocracy that exists right now to this day. So Ireland's Senate has a form of 10% more epistocracy. And the way they do it is they have a Senate with 60 seats in it. And of those 60 seats in the Senate, exactly 6 of them, 10%, are set aside. And the only people who can vote in elections for those 6 seats are people who went to one of Ireland's best universities. So it's not a big deal, in a sense. It's 10% of the seats. And it's in their upper house, which isn't that powerful. It's a little ceremonial. But it's just a little bit of way, a small way to give just a slightly higher weight to more informed voters. Are all of those people who went to those top 2 universities geniuses who know a whole lot about human rights and morality and economic policy and social justice? I don't think so. But surveys would suggest that they carry a little more information into the voting booth than other folks. Now, this idea of some kind of voting rules that favor the more educated is surprisingly not too far from home here. The American Convention on Human Rights, which was written in the late 1960s and signed by the government of Ecuador in 1969, contains these words. I cut out some stuff, but I have the quotes in. You can find the document itself quite easily. Every citizen shall enjoy the following rights and opportunities, including the right to vote. And it says the law can regulate those rights, and only on the basis of, among other things, education. So the American Convention on Human Rights at least contains the possibility, not a demand, but at least the possibility, it leaves the door open to that. A European Union document noticed this a few years ago. They just pointed this out in passing. They're like, the EU was just noticing, hey, the UN, the American Convention on Human Rights actually has this language. So this is something where countries haven't exercised this to any substantial degree outside of a few places like Ireland, but it's worth thinking through whether there are ways to give just a little more weight to voters who are just a little bit more informed on average. So Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, who in turn was a student of Socrates, Aristotle knew that democracy was a matter of degree. When we study Aristotle, we often are taught him in terms of certain boxes and orders and grids, and Aristotle's a very systematic thinker who liked everything to belong in a box. But he also knew that there was blurriness between these boxes. When he talked about the better kinds of government, one of the things he said was he thought that one of the better kinds of government would be one that blended democracy, true rule by the masses, where everybody shows up to vote on bills, true rule by the masses, where people just show up for jury cases every day. A blending of that with oligarchy, where insiders have some power for a long time. Now, Aristotle's version of oligarchy was a very mild one. To him, having a judge with a term of 1 or 2 years, pretty oligarchic. The idea of having judges who have elected terms for a couple of years, that to him was a version of oligarchy. What would he think of 6-year senators? What would he think of 14-year members of the Federal Reserve Board? This is quite oligarchical government by the standards of Aristotle. But Aristotle said one of the ways to get good governance, to get sort of the best of both worlds, was to blend democracy here with oligarchy here. And he came up with a word. He used a word that he had used elsewhere. And he called this blend of oligarchy and democracy polity. In our world, where we elect representatives who then go and make the decisions for a long time, we still love calling that democracy, although the more careful people will say, no, that's representative democracy, right? But notice, what we're calling representative democracy, Aristotle already had a word for. He called it polity. He saw it as a way to avoid the extremes of oligarchy, where you have these insiders who run things for themselves, and democracy, on the other hand, where people are uninformed and are a bit hot-headed and emotional and making decisions based on short-term feelings, short-term facts. That polity, that fusion of democracy with oligarchy is something like the governments we see around the world today. And getting that right balance, getting an improved balance, is something where I think we can do better than we've done in the past. And in particular, we've had decades. We don't have to just go to blog posts. We don't just have to go to philosophers of the past to learn these things. We can actually look at statistical tests. We can look at data. Some as simple as what I presented here, some more sophisticated. And these things can tell us which things are going to work, just as we use scientific tests to tell us which medicines are likely to work and which aren't. So the kinds of reforms that we can embrace should be ones that have passed statistical tests, historical tests, that have worked in a wide variety of places. So, how should we get the right dose of democracy? Now, I just see this as a list of possible suggestions. And part of my goal is to get people thinking, well, if you don't like one of these, maybe you'll like the other one, right? If you don't like these principles, I have other principles. One, I've already suggested, longer terms for lawmakers. Giving politicians a little more distance from the voters so they can vote for something in their first year that might be unpopular, but maybe by the fifth or sixth year, by the time it's time for re-election, those sacrifices will have paid off, and the voters will say, yeah, I didn't like this at first, but yeah, now the medicine worked out fine. Another option, giving a lot of day-to-day power to independent panels. We do this with judges. We do it with central banks. Many countries do this with forms of economic regulation and trade regulation. So it's amazing how in the modern countries that we call democracies, how much of our governance is outsourced to very oligarchical panels, and we take it for granted. Anytime you hear the word independent panel, anytime you hear the word independent body, remember, that's a code word for less democratic. Independent, at least in the countries we're talking about, code for less democratic. And thinking through it candidly, by using candid language like less democratic, will I think help us with moving reform in a better direction. So, another I've already mentioned here, that governments should be trying to hire the best in the world, not just the best in their own country. It's a big planet out there, and there are a lot of great people, and the right person for the job might well be outside your country. And it's true in your hospitals, probably true in your government as well, right? I'm always glad to go to a hospital and see doctors who've come from all around the world to work in the United States. I'm glad we don't have a citizenship requirement for medical doctors. Disappointing we have too many citizenship requirements for government bureaucrats. Even for elected officials, I'll go further. And finally, thinking through, just as a thought experiment, not for real. Just think through ways that you could give a little more voting weight to those who probably know a little bit more about the government. Maybe the Irish Senate is a model. Maybe it's just a fun thing to talk about. But either way, it's a reminder that poorly informed voters really are a barrier to good governance. And one of the ways that countries get around that is by following the previous 3 items on this list. So if we have to take the 4th one as given, we can't do anything about that. The other 3 start becoming much more appealing as alternatives to get slightly better governance, getting the right balance of democracy with oligarchy. So I'll close with this quote. William Galston, who hangs around DC a lot, he's sort of a perennial. You can see him at a lot of talks. You see him on C-SPAN a lot. He worked for President Bill Clinton. He said there's a reason why John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage is such a short book. It's because courage is not the norm for politicians. Politicians are cowardly, and we want them to be cowardly in a democracy, right? They're supposed to pander to us in a democracy, right? If I believed in pure democracy, I wouldn't want profiles in courage. I would want profiles in political pandering. I want politicians to give voters exactly what they want if I believe in 100% pure democracy. But both Galston, to some extent Bill Clinton, and certainly JFK, all admire politicians who decide to not give the voters what they want, who decide that some days the best form of governance is just a little bit less democratic. So I wrote a book about this. It's called 10% Less Democracy. I was fortunate to have Stanford University Press publish this and do a great job helping me to improve the book. And I push on these issues at much greater length and with a lot more data and a few graphs as well. But I do hope that instead of hoping for politicians to just stand up to us, instead of hoping for politicians to just be a little bit less democratic sometimes, instead, we can reform our political rules to make it just a little bit easier for our politicians to stand up to us. We can make it easier for them to have political courage. Thank you.